All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. So, as we all know, we are emerging out of this global health crisis. And for the past couple of years, we've been hearing all sorts of things about the death of cities, for example, as a matter of public health, cost of living. We've heard about crime, governance. And so the question is, as we move forward, where do we go from here? So I'd like us to spend this hour together to discuss what could be our most hopeful vision for the future of cities. And we're all, part of a city being Philadelphia. And so it should be we have a personal stake in this conversation. My name is Tim Gorshanas. I'm a faculty member at Drexel and the organizer of Speculative Futures Philadelphia. And this panel is a discussion that's organized in partnership with the Institute for Smart and Healthy Cities at Thomas Jefferson University. So we've got 4 colleagues here from Drexel and Jefferson and the University of Pennsylvania, and we're going to have a conversation about the future of cities. So we've got some experts here who are all working in this space from different angles, and they're going to share with us some of their research and knowledge, basically. So before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items, which you can also see on the screen here. This is being recorded. Everybody who registered as an attendee should get the link a little bit later, so you can watch the recording on your own. We'll also post it up on YouTube so that it'll have a life for the future and people can find it via search and hear our words again. If you've never attended a Zoom webinar, you'll see that the chat box has 2 different tabs in it. One is Q&A and one is chat. In the chat, you can feel free to share any thoughts or anything along the way with other attendees and also with the panelists here. And I'll be watching the chat as we go along. There's also the Q&A function where you can ask a question specifically, and people can upvote each other's questions, and we'll get a chance to respond to those in the Q&A section. So my vision here is we'll talk for, 40 minutes, 30 something minutes, and then we'll switch into audience Q&A, and we'll just follow the conversation and see what interesting things come up. So without any further delays, let's get started. I'd like us to start by going around, and we'll hear from each person, just giving a short introduction to your work and who you are and what you do. So I think just make it easier, we'll go by last name, alphabetical. So that means Peng, you're first. And Peng, let's hear from you. What do you do and who are you?
Thank you, Tim. Hello, everyone. My name is Peng. I'm an assistant professor at the College of Architecture and Built Environment at Jefferson. I'm also the director of 2 graduate programs here, Master of Urban Design with focus on future cities, and Master of Science in Urban Analytics and Geodesign. I'm a strong believer in technology that will help form the cities in the future. So as many of you know, the construction sector, which includes urban design, architecture, landscape architecture, is possibly the only industry sector that is way behind the other industry sectors in terms of the productivities in the last few decades. So to me, the main reason has been the lack of embracement of the innovative technologies. So my own research interest is to study and apply how we can leverage the technology, specifically the data-driven simulation-based computational design and analytics tools to predict the growth of the city, and especially when we see the pandemic and globalizations and the population growth and climate change, of course, how we can use all the tools available to us to help form and build a better future of our cities. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this panel, and I look forward to more discussions with the panelists and the audience. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Peng. All right, Allison, let's hear from you next.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here today. It's so amazing to have a cross Philadelphia University gathering. It doesn't happen enough, and so it's really nice to see everyone here. I'm an assistant professor in city planning at University of Pennsylvania, where I direct our smart cities concentration. My research focuses on water management in cities. So I'm specifically interested, well, the way it engages with kind of future cities is probably across two dimensions. One of them is climate change. So our future city has to shift along with our changing climate. There's a little adage that says climate mitigation, or kind of stopping climate change as it's happening, is all about greenhouse gases or carbon. But climate adaptation, so changing our behaviors to respond to the climate changes that are already underway, is really all about water. So water is changing in its timing and its quantities, and so we're going to need to adapt our water systems. So this is going to be a big challenge for our future cities. But a big opportunity is that we also have this emerging trend of digitization of a lot of services. And so I think we're going to be able to kind of jump on that digital wave and modernize a lot of our infrastructure, including our water infrastructure. So how does this relate to health too? I know we're kind of touching on health and sustainability. I'm going to suggest that water is one of our most important aspects of public health in a city. So if we have clean water, we have a healthy population. And when we don't have clean water, we have an unhealthy population. And this is true all around the globe, whether you're in West Virginia and you're dealing with industrial contaminants in your water, or you're in Alabama and your sewage or septic tanks aren't working and you're dealing with hookworm outbreaks, or you're in Malawi and you don't have a developed wastewater infrastructure and you have the largest cholera outbreak you've had in decades. Maintaining our water resources is really essential to our public health and also our ecosystem health, but I'll leave it at that. So that's my work. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, Frank.
My name is Frank Lee. I'm a full professor at Drexel University. And all that means is that I'm really old and been in academia way too long. I've been at Drexel close to 20 years. 10 years I was into computer science, and for the last 10 years I've been in digital media. I founded the game design program, and my area of creative work and research involves using emerging technology for to explore its use in entertainment and engagement. And I guess unlike Allison and Peng and others here doing kind of real work, I kind of play. That's sort of my role and that's my work. But in particular, I guess I'm interested in how we can, I fundamentally believe that people are social by nature, and whatever smart city, smart technology we create, we cannot ignore that fundamental fact. And way I approach that aspect of it is using AR, VR, GPS, anything that's sort of coming up, to see how we can use that to enhance or augment social aspect, not necessarily virtual, but sort of physical, real social aspects of human experience. And a couple of examples, I guess, of type of work that I've done is, for example, using or thinking about AR and VR and repurposing that as a way to reimagine what poems and short stories would be like. Using GPS and thinking about its use of potentially creating thousands of people, citywide hide and go seek. And I guess I'm mostly well known for kind of reimagining Skyscraper as a game display and so on. So those are the type of stuff that I do.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Yeah, the social aspect of health is definitely, hugely important, as you're saying. So it's, different from water and that sort of aspect of health, but totally. All right, and last but not least, we've got Edgar.
Right. Yeah, Edgar Starr. I'm also a professor at Thomas Jefferson University, and I'm the director of the Institute for Smart and Healthy Cities. So talking just a little bit about the Institute. So it was formed about 2 years ago as a collaboration between 3 different colleges: the College of Architecture and the Built Environment, the College of Population Health, and the College of Engineering and Design. So purposefully, the position was such as that we really have to collaborate across multiple disciplines. And I think that's really, really important when you look at the effects climate change has on the, not only on the city, but I think more important on the individuals who live in cities. So we are sort of framing the our aspects defining smart and healthy cities in 3 different scales. The largest scale, obviously, the city. If you're looking at citywide effects on the population, but also infrastructure, heat islands, green infrastructure, transportation, energy, and so forth. And then the next scale is the building scale, where we looking into performance criteria in buildings and how buildings can be better adjusted to the new norm, the climate change, as well as we're looking at control aspects and so forth. And then the smaller scale, that's where a lot of our industrial designers come into play, is the device scale. So what can we wear, what can we develop on an individual scale to be better equipped and better responsive to climate change aspects? And to do so, to really develop that broad sort of across the campus approach, we're sponsoring cross-collaborative research projects. So we have the first round out where teams across the campus looking into the effects on climate change on vulnerable population, for example, and how to mediate these. And so maybe in a nutshell, what we try to see is where are we right now in terms of developing concepts for smart and healthy cities, and how do we need to calibrate these concepts down the road for the new norm in 10, 15, 20 years from now.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so we've heard a little bit from each panelist in terms of the work that you've been doing, and now we'll kind of go into a broader conversation. When we're looking at the future and trying to imagine what the near future could hold for us, I think it's always good to look at the near past, right? So where have we been? Where are the trend lines leading? So I'd like to begin with this question: how have cities changed in the past couple of decades? And maybe you can each approach that, from your own lens of the kind of work you do, and maybe respond to each other and see what kind of conversation comes up. So whoever would like to jump in first on this, how have cities changed in the past few decades?
Maybe I give it a shot. So first of all, I think it's really hard to answer that question without knowing in what continent and what ecosystem you're playing. So if you ask me as a European, how European cities have changed, I would say greatly. Public transportation is really on the rise. Biking, e-biking, bike lanes, all these things are really prominent and embraced by the citizens. This is not a top-down thing. People wanted more biking. They wanted more pedestrian zones. So the US, I think it's a slightly different story. I think the US is, from no hard feelings here, but I think a little bit behind the curve when it comes to transforming cities into much greener and much more sort of livable cities. There are some good examples like Washington, perhaps, and maybe Austin and others. But in general, I think that European cities are much more tuned into, and I leave it up to the others. Maybe they can give us some insight how Asian cities even faster transforming in that respect.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on this. So as you can tell, I originally from Asia, and so definitely Asian cities have different challenges compared to US and European cities. For example, one clear observation is the high density. So how we can accommodate the huge amount of population moving to the cities, and with an affordable and livable housing and urban spaces, that has been a challenge. And because of the high density, and many Asian cities, like European cities, has been able to successfully adopt it to public transit systems and promotion of walking and biking. But you have different issues with high density, and also through the skyscrapers emerge in the Asian cities. So people kind of trapped in their individual units in the sky. So the challenge, I think, because in addition to my role at Jefferson, I'm also affiliated with a nonprofit organizations named the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. So we studied a lot on how tall building can be part of the future sustainable cities. So one fundamental issue we discovered is the lack of communal green space within tall building, and also at the bottom of the building and on top of the tall buildings. For example, most of the cities we have seen in Asia and many other cities, tall building has been considered as isolated air conditioning glass boxes, right? So it's just a stand on the city fabric. So having said this, that reminded me when I visited Burj Khalifa, which is the tallest building in the world currently, I took a picture there, and it was amazing. The world's tallest building is built surrounded with highways. So tall buildings is supposed to be part of the urban fabric and part of the urban infrastructure. The highway should be the opposite components against the tall building. How can tall building and the highway merge together? And how tall building can stand on the ground and have a more welcoming and communal space. And you still feel tall building is part of your street life. And also for tall buildings beyond 200 meters, 400 meters, even 600 meters tall, how people can still enjoy the communal space, street life in the sky. So we don't have to go all the way down to the street to get a coffee through the elevator. And how we can create more sustainable vertical cities across those skyscrapers is also a challenge and interesting research topic.
I can jump in there. So I completely agree with Edgar's point that it's a little hard to identify specific trends globally, but there's one that's really important, which is no matter where you are in the globe, we're urbanizing at rates that we haven't seen since maybe the early 20th century. So there's just masses of people flooding to cities, especially in Asia and in Africa. And this is putting a lot of pressure on our urban services, like Peng was just talking about. So there's big questions about how we continue to provide these public goods to people as we have more and more people drawing from them. And then related to what Edgar was saying as well about maybe some issues in the US cities is specific to the US. Well, things are changing a little bit with recent infrastructure bills, but we have been investing about 1.5% of our GDP in infrastructure. This is the lowest rate of federal infrastructure investment, or one of them in the world. So this is kind of driving us into this sort of shortfall of investment and is causing a lot of decline in infrastructure while we have more pressure on infrastructure in cities because of these rates of urbanization. So this kind of 1-2 punch of urbanization and lack of investment is going to create some new opportunities for us. So I'll leave that for the next question.
I would love to jump in, mainly because this is not my area of expertise, so I could put my hat on as a layperson and ask sort of questions that I really want to ask. Hopefully this is also resonant with the people who are listening. I guess I have two questions. One is, there certainly, I mean, having read a lot of newspapers, I know people are sort of flocking to cities, especially in Asia. I know that's true, but it must be true in the US. But I feel like COVID had kind of upended that a little bit, where people are now, because of Zoom and other work from home, so people sort of are leaving cities. A lot of the rentals in New York and other places are essentially falling right in cities. So I'm wondering whether, do you see that as a contemporary thing, or that as a like a fundamental shift in direction for how people live both in cities and surrounding? That's one. The other question that I had is, being Korean, by birth. I'm kind of fascinated with what's going on in Korea. One aspect that I've seen is that the buildings, the tall apartments and small surrounding sort of become like balkanized cities in themselves. They're shopping areas. They never have to leave. There's tutoring that's going on, little play areas. So they just kind of, children can play together. There are even schools within those areas. So I'm wondering whether this sort of balkanization of like small little micro cities within cities is something to be concerned about, is the way the future is going to go, and so on. Especially from a social aspect, I'm sort of fundamentally concerned that we are even kind of setting up little, I guess, fences around probably economically kind of similar people, right, within those areas and so on. So those are two questions that I had.
Mm. Maybe as a quick follow-up. So I think obviously all cities are under climate threat, and global warming is increasing. Also, you can say that, for example, European countries or the Western world is pretty stable when it comes to CO2 emissions. So they almost stabilized it. So that's good news. You know, you can say it's good news. But on the other hand, they're the largest economic countries, or population-wise largest countries like China and India and large parts of Africa, still on an extremely steep growth trajectory. So even if the Western world stops emitting more CO2s, I think these countries will catch up with the Western world. And so what that means is that we will emit, a lot of these, carbons into the air. And so that's where, coming back to my initial statement, we need to see what's the new norm in 15, 20 years from now, and how can we make actually our cities ready for these new challenges. And when I say cities, I really mean the people who are living in these cities. So what are the mechanisms we have to develop now to mediate the negative effects of climate change in 20 years from now? And again, I think we're very focusing on the Western side of the world. I think I don't want to say the problems, but the rising large sort of emissions will come not any longer from the West, will come from Africa and in Asia.
I could speak to Frank's questions for just a second. I don't know that I have all the answers, but one of the trends that I know exists, I think this is probably fair to say we can generalize this a little bit all over the world, but I'm more familiar with the trend in the US. There's been periods where people have moved towards the cities, and then periods where people have moved away from the cities, and then towards the cities and away from the cities, and towards the cities and away. And this is often related to public health crises. So in the early 1900s in the US, the cities were really dirty and people started to kind of step outside to suburbs. But the thing is that we also, and this would probably be true in a lot of places in the world, are not doing a lot to support rural economies. And so while people might be stepping out to the suburbs a little bit during COVID, I mean, we've seen a lot of resurgence in real estate markets and urban cores because fundamentally a lot of people want the services that are offered in cities. But people that are in the rural areas kind of need to come to cities for economic opportunities now. And especially as we get more of our goods from around the world, a lot of our economic opportunities are in the service sector, and then you just need to be adjacent to other people. So I don't see there being any change in the trajectory of urbanization whatsoever. In fact, I think all the economic forces are there to accelerate urbanization over the coming years. So maybe COVID provides a little blip in people kind of moving out for a bit, and that's really only the wealthy and really only people who have jobs that can work from home. And then, but I think for the most part, we're all just going to continue to consolidate. As for the situation in South Korea, that's really interesting. But one thing that I think is fascinating too is an advantage of cities is that sort of horizontal and vertical exchange of ideas. This is where a lot of our economic productivity comes from. And so if you have this siloization, is that a word, of people in South Korea, I think you would start to see a decline in that horizontal exchange of ideas. And I wonder if people will want that. I think they might want to reconnect.
Yeah, really interesting. I think this is a great segue into our sort of next topic, which is looking at, challenges for the near future. So we've talked about some really interesting things so far. I mean, climate change has been a big theme and looking forward to addressing that. I really like, Allison, what you said about, you had a really nice way to say it, but, on one hand, we can look at emissions, but then water is sort of like the long-term big issue, right? We've talked about issues in governance, sort of maybe some tension between top-down and bottom-up, especially, Edgar, what you mentioned in terms of green space and bike infrastructure and that sort of thing. Peng, you talked about this sort of maybe a tension between high density and communalism, maybe is a way to put it, which has sort of also been echoed in Frank's questions about the silos, right? So there's some really, really interesting challenges that just come out of the past trends. And so I'm wondering now, what other challenges do you see, or what are the biggest challenges for cities? And again, understanding that maybe we can't make blanket statements about the whole world, but if you wanted to comment on certain regions you're familiar with or keeping your eye on, or which may present especially big challenges. So whoever would like to get us started with that one.
Well, maybe I can quickly jump in. So let's say focusing on Philadelphia, so not too far away. I think the biggest challenge in Philly is it's underfunded. In fact, the people who actually made some money, they moved out of the city, are working now online. So the city is actually even sacrificing some of the tax dollars they got from folks who were not living in the city. The infrastructure is completely sort of obsolete, especially Allison, the water system, sewage systems. It's really 19th century and was never really fixed. Public transportation, SEPTA is pretty okay, but then, buses and other systems are needs a lot of money. So I think the biggest problem is really funding to actually fix problems which piled up over the last 50 years before we actually getting to reworking, a complete new way of, infrastructures or live work conditions. I see that the city actually tries hard. So they really reworking brownfield areas close to the airport and others. So there's something going on. It's a good sign that things happen. But I think to tackle aspects like fresh water rising water levels, flooding, heat waves, heat island effects, negative heat island effects, I think it takes some real funding to move these things forward.
So I'd like to follow up on the financial viability to maintain a support to this. To me, the biggest challenge will still be around climate change. The challenges, in my view, are not just okay. For example, this winter we don't feel as cold as last winter, and prior to the last winter and also we see flooding, we see fires, we see earthquakes, we see natural disasters everywhere now. And from certain points, personally, I felt I started to hear more often, hey, this is a 1,000-year event. And statistically, 1,000-year events is supposed to happen every 1,000 years, statistically, right? But we started to hear more and more often. So I taught a design studio where I was in Chicago, in a context of because of the natural disasters, so with climate change, people realized we have to abandon our current city because financially, not just environmental, the city cannot self-sustain, and also financially, for example, how much money we need to put in to be resilient against the flooding, against the earthquake, against the tsunami, and we did research on so in different climate zones and different terrains, where should people move to if they have to abandon their current cities? And at that time, people felt I was greedy, but a couple of years later, for example, the capital city of Indonesia, the president announced they're going to move their capital city, Jakarta, to another place. So a city like Miami, for example, in US, would we face a point people realize, okay, sea level rise is irreversible. We just cannot do anything about that. And we have to move the entire population to a different place, which is inherently more sustainable, which means less risk of natural disasters, more clean and drinkable water, and not so cold, not so hot, which means the energy saving. So again, that might seems to be the very far future, but we have already seen some cities in the globally has been taking actions on that. So none of us wanted to see that day happens, but I think we have to be far more aggressively design and maintain the city from the view of climate change.
I can step in. I love to talk about climate change being a big problem because it is. I want to acknowledge one of the comments that popped up in the chat, which was saying that homelessness and crime is a big problem in Philadelphia. And yeah, I think that's 100% correct. And then also sort of speaks to this other problem that I probably need to think about a little bit more in my work, which is just this idea that we have this just widening economic gap, and everything is becoming so expensive in cities, and there's not a lot of resources for people who don't have money. So ensuring that we are really equitably distributing urban services and making sure that everybody is taken care of through cities, and we create these really livable cities for absolutely everyone, is an essential challenge in the future. Maybe this is sort of getting ahead of things, but I think that there's some, given the sort of context of this panel being about future cities and also like sort of smart cities, I think there is some opportunities here that a lot of digital services can offer us. And I think we're going to talk about opportunities next, maybe, but perhaps another challenge to consider as we're thinking about the opportunity of digital services is there's also this issue of, let's see, dealing with things like digital privacy, algorithmic fairness, and then a huge one right now that is not spoken about enough is cyber attack. So there's just, I mean, the cost of cyber insurance is going up and up and up. Cities are getting hit by ransomware attacks like, hundreds of times per day. So managing all of these issues that are sort of related to digitization, I think is going to be a big challenge for us to wrap our heads around as we think about how we roll more smart services into the city. And so while smart services in my mind are absolutely necessary to combat all of these issues that we've brought up, they also come with their own issues to deal with too. So unfortunately, there's no silver bullet ever.
Just to kind of, I guess, jump in a little bit. Certainly, I mean, just from a layperson point of view and listening to the expertise of the panel here, I feel the world is so dark. I want to just go back to my bed and hide underneath my blanket. But I feel like we can also try to address, and this is, I think, where Allison was sort of heading towards. Are there sort of positive signs? It might not address or even get anywhere near the fundamental problems, right, that's been sort of discussed, but are there some potential positive amelioration of some of these issues? I think the extensive use of telehealth, especially talking about sort of rural side and their access to healthcare, might be one positive sign. Certainly, I feel like the dirt cheap aspect of smartphones, essentially computers, has sort of brought some equity of access to information. I mean, there's still economic issues, but certainly it doesn't cost $3,000 to buy a computer. You get it with your wires, service plan, and so on. So I'm wondering, from all three, everyone here, whether there are some potential upcoming, either near or near distant technology that may try to take a step toward some of these directions and so on.
Well, this is, I think you're talking more towards what makes actually a smart city. So, and that's a little bit away from carbon neutrality and global warming and the effects on this. So it's more like, let's say, what are the components? And, if you talk to tech companies, they're talking about the Internet of Things and the network of devices and controlling everything from energy flow to transportation to climate, indoor and outdoor climate and everything, and then connected even maybe to personal health and so forth. So if you talk to the building industry, it's probably talking about embodied carbon footprints and carbon neutrality, life cycle assessment. So when it comes to political entities, so you maybe talk about the democratic distribution of goods across the entire spectrum within the population. So equity and inclusion, I think it's a key word. So for me, these are all aspects describing what is actually a smart or future city for me and what city I want to live. So to get there, well, it's a multifaceted problem. So from our perspective, we want to tackle it to increase the livability and the health status across a large population. So that's why we want to make the connection between the built environment and environmental aspects, as well as the individual and population health. So, but in a nutshell, it's a very sort of wide-footed problem.
Yeah, thank you. I think what this is highlighting for me is the way that all of these challenges are kind of intermingled. And so I appreciate the comment about homelessness and crime. I mean, it's not the area of expertise of anybody here, but we really do see, these things are connected. And I'm also thinking about the sort of social aspects to wellness that Frank, that you were talking about earlier. So we've already started moving towards the direction of positive and exciting things. And so let's continue on that. So we've talked a little bit about, the promise of smart city possibly, although as Allison pointed out, it does have some risks, right? Particularly in terms of cybersecurity, possibilities with telehealth and the proliferation of smartphones. What other emerging trends are you guys seeing that are positive or exciting or anything that might give us some hope, technologies or research or anything else?
So I can give it a quick shot, but I will play the ball into Peng's corner, because he's really the expert when it comes to parametric design tooling for urban planning. And I think that's from my vantage point, I think that is really the next very large trend, that artificial intelligence really gets fully involved in the planning process of large urban developments. But I don't want to talk about something which is really not my domain. It's really Peng's domain.
Thank you, Edgar. I'd like to circle back to what Frank mentioned in the beginning. He's from the gaming industry or gaming discipline. I think a lot of the tools we're currently using, we'll be using, actually we learn from other industries. For example, the immersive technologies we mentioned, the AR, VR, we started to apply those technologies to the urban design process. I think that works very well, because as Edgar and Allison talk about, this is our discipline is not a single subject, right? It would involve a multidisciplinary research and also a community engaged process. So having the immersive technology like AR, VR with some interactive platform, so everyone can understand and interact with the data, with the design, not just one single design solution, but hundreds and thousands of design solutions, and with the changes they might make, and also see the immediate impact on certain aspects. For example, if you move if you, for example, if you lower the heights of the proposed tall building in the city, what the shadow going to be changed, how that will impact the thermal comfort on the streets, and what's the financial cost, but what's the financial implications as well. So we can present all the work through these new technologies and bring all stakeholders together and engage the developers, governments, and the local communities. I think a lot of technologies are very helpful in designing the future cities as well.
I guess, I mean, talking about, because I deal mainly with sort of emerging technologies and its potential use. Some of the stuff that I'm certainly a big fan of is just-in-time information, right? The ones that has been brought up by smartphones, essentially a computer. It requires internet access everywhere. America falls far behind like countries like in Asia and so on. You know, certainly I'm a long advocate of declaring internet as a public utility, making sure that it's accessible to rural areas and other places as a fundamental utility. But certainly, you're not quite there yet in the United States. But once we have that sort of essentially fundamental superhighway of internet, I feel like democratization of information is one key thing that I think is sort of emerging, and that's just the way of the future. Other things I feel like with that sort of brings people closer together, not necessarily physically, virtually. So I'm still amazed by the fact that my young kids, they're 8 and 11 right now, could talk to their grandfather in Korea using FaceTime. I mean, that's something that you could not even imagine, you know, like 10, 15 years ago, that immediate access of bringing people right in front of you halfway around the globe. I think is a trend that we are moving towards. That's, for me, it's making me excited about technology and its potential use as a way of engagement and entertainment.
So we talked about a lot of different challenges, and I see technology as being a way to address many of these challenges. So let me just quickly summarize that. 3 key challenges are, for me, bringing our carbon emissions down like immediately, delivering more services to more people, and then increasing the flexibility of our cities to respond to wider variations in conditions. So here's how emerging technologies can help with that. We need a lot to bring our carbon down, we need to electrify a lot of different sources, and we need to learn how to manage our grid differently. A lot of distributed sensors and new algorithms are going to help us figure out how to manage electricity much more efficiently in cities. So that's really exciting in terms of helping us drop our carbon emissions. In terms of delivering more services to more people, there's a lot of efficiency that can be gained through digitization, and there's a lot of people that should be able to access new services if we can deliver them at a lower cost. And then the third one, in terms of increasing flexibility, this is one that really gets me excited. But right now, our cities are very static. They're built out of concrete, which doesn't adapt very well, and other like hard materials. And they're really designed for people that are sort of healthy, maybe age 18 to 65. And they're also sort of designed for this climate conditions that existed in Philadelphia in the 1850s when a lot of the city was built. So we're seeing new extremes with climate, and there's a wider variety of people that want to maybe interact with the city. And I think a lot of emerging technologies allow us to customize the delivery of services to people's needs a little bit more minutely. So for example, in my class that talks about city sensors, students come up with ideas of how we could use sensors to make cities more adaptable. And one group came up with a project that people who had sort of different needs when crossing the street could potentially wear an RFID wristband or attach something to a cane or wheelchair that pings the crosswalk controller, and depending on what your needs are, you could get a customized aid in crossing the street. So maybe a longer crossing time, or lights or sounds helping you guide across the street. So rather than everybody always getting the same crossing times, it would adapt to user needs. Another example might be, we use the exact same quality of water that's treated up to drinking water standards for absolutely everything in the city, even if you could use a lower quality water. So one of the things sensors and like distributed valves and distributed, I guess treatment processes could help us do is better match the quality of water that we're delivering to the user's needs. And this could help lower costs and increase efficiency. So it's these sort of customizations that can make, take our cities up to the 21st century at least.
I wonder if I could sort of jump in with one question. Is there a potential role for crowdsourcing / citizen science for some of these issues? And the reason why I bring that up is I thought there was a project that I read about out of Berkeley that was using like 50,000 cell phones. You download an application and it's using its vibration sensor to try to predict earthquake or to provide rapid, I guess, early warning for earthquake and so on. So given the deployment of these multi-sensors that everyone has, right? Like 6 billion sensors across the world, is there a possible utility of that for some of these issues and so on?
I totally think so. It'll be a combination of sort of officially deployed sensors and citizen sensors.
So our industrial design students, for example, they developed a product which measures the water content in the earth in public parks. So, and it signals this to a centralized hub so that the city knows which plants or which trees need to be watered and which doesn't at that point in time. So that it saves time and also water / money. So that's a really simple device. So it's a one item gets censored, but it's actually very, very powerful if you use that across the entire city. So every tree has one, and maybe not every shrub, but a larger green area. So it's one aspect where really a $5 sensor can make a huge difference.
It's really cool to hear about Peng was talking about sort of innovations in the design process. We've heard a bunch about innovations in terms of using our resources more wisely, from our smartphones to cheap sensors. I'd like to bring up the question that we got from Jen, which I think echoes some of the stuff we were talking about earlier in terms of governance and how we're using our tax dollars and how these resources are getting distributed. I don't know if anybody would like to comment on this, but the question is, do you think building sustainability into our future can come from the federal level? I guess this is United States specifically. We have this sort of interesting federated system. Does it come from the federal level, or is a more effective approach for cities to work autonomously to focus on improving their own infrastructures? Any responses there?
Yeah, I have opinions on that. I'd love to hear Edgar's though too. Go ahead, Edgar.
I think it has to come from both ends. So there's ordinance requirements, guidelines, and so forth. That needs to come from I think a government level. Also, the funding for certain deployments of technologies need to come from the government. For example, CO2 emissions caps and that kind of stuff. On the other hand, I think the approach also needs to be fine-tuned to the problem. So it's a different story when you want to, turn Philadelphia into a smart and healthy city in comparison to a city which is in a hot and arid climate zone, let's say New Mexico. So their problems are different than our problems. So I think in that perspective, there's probably some overlap, but also very specific aspects which need to be addressed. And so it's interesting. It's interesting to compare cities, actually. So we have one project going on. We will exhibit this at the Biennale in Venice, where we're looking at Philadelphia and Venice, two cities, very different, but have the same issues with rising ocean levels. So, and how do these two cities deal with that challenge? So, and there are some similarities and some very unique, different approaches to that challenge. So that's sort of my 5 cents to it.
I think it's so important for these different levels of governance to kind of proceed simultaneously. So it's hard conceivably our federal government is mostly representative of the US, though of course there's some reasons to believe maybe it's not. But one of the things that is going to be challenging is for the federal government to get really far ahead of where we want our cities to be. So that means you have to have activism and action and everything in cities to kind of get people on board to start to vote and advocate for what they want to see from the federal government. So then the other challenge is that we couldn't just leave it to cities to figure it out on their own, because most of our infrastructures don't really end at the city boundaries. And we need coordination of what's happening outside the cities too and across states. So that's going to happen at state and federal level. And so we need the federal government to kind of push this coordination between cities and spaces and redistribute money and make sure that we have infrastructure systems that are working together. But we also need cities to kind of drive these ideas on what this future could look like.
I'm wondering, I guess, my sort of naive optimist view of how the state federal system will work is that states work as an experimental lab, right? Trying different ideas at a smaller scale, and something that kind of percolates up can be essentially adopted sort of, I guess, nationwide at the federal level. But because politics and everything else that gets into it, certainly we don't have that. But ideally, that's sort of, I guess, how you would want, or how it would work, because you have 50 states trying different ideas. Some of the ideas that really work well then gets adopted as a sort of essentially federal guidelines or federal rule.
Well, California has enough money that they kind of drive their changes then push to the federal level too, and Texas to maybe a little bit of a lesser degree.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. We're unfortunately coming up to the end of our hour. So I've got one more question for us. We've talked a lot about big picture stuff, from like governance to climate change. And so I'm wondering if we can bring this down to the level of any individual person watching. And do you have any suggestions or advice for viewers or for each other or for us? What is the number one thing anybody watching could do to make a difference for the future of cities? Is it reading a book? Is it voting? What should we do? Any ideas?
It's a good question. I get asked quite often by my friends and family back in Europe, flying quite often across the Atlantic. So they're questioning really my carbon footprint, my personal carbon footprint, using, flying all over the place. And I really, if everybody would look into how we actually as individuals dealing with global warming, carbon neutrality and so forth, it's an interesting question to answer. So for example, eating meat, especially beef, contributes actually greatly to carbon emissions. So one of my students in one of my classes developed a software package, an iPhone app, who tracks your personal carbon emissions, what you eat, how often you walk, when you take a car. It's pretty fascinating, our footprint on this planet in comparison to somebody, let's say, in Africa or developing countries. So my advice would be, I don't want to be the preacher here, but we need to be conscious that carbon neutrality and carbon footprint is not somebody else's issue. It's our issue, and we're all contributing to it.
I have a slightly, oh, sorry, Peng, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think individually, there's a lot we can do, but just want to experience my experience. When I just moved to US, specifically Chicago, 12 to 13 years ago, I lived in a tall residential building, apartment building. I was shocked. In around September, the heat was on. And I have to wear a t-shirt. Around September, the heat was on, and during the winter time, I had to wear a t-shirt in the apartment. So I think, specifically in this country, I would advise everyone can be a bit more tolerant with how you might feel comfortable with temperature. So you don't have to wear a t-shirt in winter at home. So that bring down the question how you can manage the energy individually at home. So that's my small advice.
I like the idea of just being more tolerant in general. So my number one piece of advice is a little different. So cities are really complicated and we have all of these different interacting factors. So there's climate changes, there's issues with affordable housing, there's issues with like the way the insurance sector incentivizes particular patterns of growth. There's issue with transportation, there's issues with communication, there's issues with schools, there's issues with general economic frameworks. There's so many complicated things happening. And unfortunately, I don't think there's like a button you can push that fixes them all. Instead, I think it's necessary to kind of slowly unlock a lot of these problems. And so what my number one thing you can do is just pick something. Pick something that you like, that you think benefits the public in some way or another, and just work on that one thing. And this is amazing that there's not a silver bullet in a lot of ways, because it allows us all a lot of different entry points into this big knotty problem, because they all come together and they're all important. So whatever it is you're doing, stop looking for the perfect thing and just find the thing that you like and just do that thing.
I guess I have sort of two sort of messages. The first one is that technology is wonderful, but it's a double-edged sword. Every technology will be a double-edged sword. So we have wonderful technology like deep learning and other stuff that's able to help us and augment our abilities in a number of ways, but all that along brings with it deep fakes, cyber threats, and other stuff, and so on. So I think first and foremost, be aware of the dual use of technology, whatever technology might be, and just be knowledgeable about it. That's sort of the general message I would have. And if nothing else, just drop everything, drop all your work, drop all your worries, and go play a board game. There are some wonderful board games that are out there. I will recommend two. Pandemic is a wonderful cooperative board game where you're trying to save the world from a pandemic. And the other is Ticket to Ride, is also a wonderful family-based game. But I have hundreds of recommendations if you need. Just drop everything, gather your family, and just play a board game.
Wonderful, thank you. And I'll just make a note that the makers of Pandemic are actually working on a game about climate change and working together to solve climate change. It's called Daybreak. I guess it'll come out in maybe a year or so. Well, this has been a really wonderful conversation. I think this is a good place to bring it to a close. And also, we're out of time. So I think we could have talked for much longer, but this was a really wonderful, thoughtful conversation. I hope everybody watching has learned a little bit more about the future of cities, and I hope that this conversation has sparked your interest in some of these topics and that you'll do something to get involved and do what you can. And like Allison said, find something that drives you and dig into that thing. Just a reminder, the registered attendees, you'll get a link to this recording afterwards, and keep an eye out for our upcoming events, both from Speculative Futures Philadelphia and from the Institute for Smart and Healthy Cities. And feel free to look up our fellow panelists and see what they're up to in the future. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you for everyone watching.
So nice
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for organizing this. Thank you.
I'm gonna go play a board game.
Bye, everyone.